Welcome to Module 4 of the EAT101 Nutrition Basics series. In this module, we'll be covering carbohydrates. As the presentation builds on what was covered in Modules 1, 2 and 3, please watch those modules first if you haven't already. Everything that follows will make a lot more sense. Carbohydrates supply our bodies with energy and really do very little else. Carbohydrate-rich foods may provide other nutrients, vitamins and minerals, proteins and fats for example, but the carbohydrates themselves are pretty much all destined to be used or stored as fuel. Carbohydrates are arguably not an essential nutrient because, as we'll see later, they can be made by our bodies from the amino acids that make up protein and also certain components of fat. These are all carbohydrate-rich foods. The word carbohydrate, when used in nutrition, simply means sugars and starches. In terms of unprocessed foods, grains, legumes, fruit, and starchy vegetables are the most carbohydrate-rich. Most processed foods contain some, if not a lot, of carbohydrates. With the exception of sugar at the top, all these foods contain some fat and or protein, as well as their carbohydrates. Many of these foods also contain fiber, vitamins, minerals, and other substances that can have a positive or negative effect on your health. You certainly may consider some healthier than others, and you will like some more than others. However, they all contain a high proportion of carbohydrates that our bodies would need to respond to and process if and when we eat them. What nutrition scientists and therefore food labels mean when using the word carbohydrate is some combination of glucose, fructose or fructose, and galactose. These are the common monosaccharides, with mono simply meaning one or one unit, and saccharide meaning sugar. When these monosaccharides are strung together, we get familiar things like lactose, also known as milk sugar, sucrose, commonly called table sugar or just sugar, and starch. Other potentially familiar saccharides include maltose or malt sugar, which is made of 2 units of glucose, and high fructose corn syrup, made of long strings of glucose and fructose. Organic chemists and biochemists include a lot more in their definition of carbohydrate, but in terms of food, these are the important ones. Knowing the details of the chemistry isn't important, but understanding that no matter what some authors would like you to believe, once you've eaten them, the enzymes in your intestines get to work breaking these down into their monosaccharide components. Only after these enzymes like lactase, sucrase, and amylase do their job of cutting up the carbohydrates you've eaten, do the resulting glucose, fructose, and galactose units get absorbed by your intestine into your cells and bloodstream. Most of our cells can't use fructose or galactose, so our livers convert fructose and galactose into glucose, which most of our cells can use. Fructose can also be converted to less desirable things like uric acid. For that and other reasons, you'll often see the possible problems with eating a lot of fructose featuring in the news headlines. But that topic is really for another time in another module. Glucose, wherever it may have come from, can be used by the liver to generate energy. Or it can be converted to glycogen, which is really the animal version of starch, and is the form in which our cells store glucose. The liver can also convert glucose to fat. Alternatively, the liver can release the glucose into your bloodstream so it can be taken up by other cells. These cells in turn can use glucose either as fuel straight away or store it for later. Our bodies can only store a few hundred grams of glucose. Exactly how much depends on how big you are and how much muscle you have. Once our tanks are full, any surplus glucose gets turned into fat, either in our livers, as mentioned, or in special fat storage cells called adipocytes. That's the fat you see under the skin and around the organs. All that assumes a fairly normally functioning body, but people with fatty livers, metabolic syndrome, type 2 diabetes for example, are constantly converting at least some glucose to fat, whether that be some stored glucose or glucose that's recently been eaten in a meal. Whereas the rest of us only really do this after we've just had a high carbohydrate meal, people with these metabolic conditions like fatty liver, type 2 diabetes and metabolic syndrome really do this 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So as varied as these foods seem, and as much as some are better for our health than others, the process of digestion and the activities of your liver break these digestible carbohydrates down to form glucose, which can then be stored, used as energy, or converted to fat. In practice, this means that having honey is not appreciably different to having table sugar, nor is having agave nectar or whatever the latest most popular and supposedly healthy source of sugar is. I'm not suggesting that the details, such as the form of carbohydrate or the food it's in, don't matter at all, but they matter less than is often suggested. Fruits and vegetables contain more vitamins and minerals as well as fiber than sweets, for example, but the carbohydrates are much the same. 100 grams of sugar from one source will take a similar effort by your body to process and deal with as that 100 grams from another source. Sometimes it's just the overall packaging is healthier. To end this brief introduction to carbohydrate metabolism, it's worth repeating what was mentioned in modules 2 and 3, namely that amino acids from protein and certain parts of fat can also be converted to glucose if needed. So how much carbohydrate, especially sugars, are in some common foods? Here are some nice visuals, courtesy of the folks at sugarstacks.com. The amount of carbohydrate, particularly sugar, in many foods and drinks will probably surprise you. These are nice examples of why we at Built for Motion advise against drinking calories by having sodas, energy drinks, pop, or fruit juices. Fruit is sweet, so it should come as no surprise that it contains sugar. By drying that fruit, the vitamin content is reduced and most of the water removed, but all the sugar remains. Because of the missing water, which provides a lot of the bulk, it's much easier to overconsume dried fruit. So really, dried fruit isn't so much a healthy option. Also, although natural yogurt can be very healthy, low-fat yogurts often contain extra sugar to make up for the taste and texture that would otherwise be there if it included the original fat. Much as drying fruit concentrates more sugar in a smaller bite, juicing fruit also makes it easier to overconsume, as the fiber and therefore sense of bulk is removed, but almost all the sugar remains. To really see this for yourself, make your own juice from apples or from oranges. Squeeze the juice enough to fill a large glass. Then think about it. Would you eat that many oranges or apples in one go? And the answer is probably not. And if you did, you'd still be better off than if you had them as juice. Now you may have slightly different sweets and snacks where you live, and you might have slightly different taste preferences, but chances are they're just as high in sugar as these examples. Also, manufacturers will often emphasize certain ingredients deemed healthy by highlighting them or hinting at them on packaging, sometimes even in the name of the actual food product. This is a tactic that creates what psychologists call a health halo. But as you can see, just because something has a few ingredients that are touted as healthy doesn't mean there isn't plenty of sugar tucked away as well. Condiments also often hide a surprisingly large amount of sugar, so making your own sauces, as long as you don't include sugar in the recipe, can make a large difference to how much sugar you're having each day. Every so often, the fact that the sugar in carrots is rapidly absorbed by the body makes the rounds, and we'll discuss this concept of glycemic index or GI a little bit later. Although it is true, it's also irrelevant. Look at how many carrots you would need to eat to get the same amount of sugar as one chocolate bar. Now you probably have questions like, how much carbohydrate? What carbohydrates? When? And what are good sources of carbohydrates? Here things are going to get a little bit more involved and a little bit more technical, and that's because many of the conditions rather common these days affect how our bodies use and even tolerate carbohydrates. So what follows will touch a little bit on conditions like type 2 diabetes, fatty liver, and metabolic syndrome. There are other presentations on our website looking more specifically at these conditions, so if what follows is relevant to you but isn't 100% clear, please check out those videos to get a better understanding. For now, how much carbohydrate? The first question is one of those how long is a piece of string questions. How much carbohydrate would be most beneficial to you depends on the type of diet you follow, the types and amounts of exercise you do, your total energy needs, the health of your metabolism, and your personal goals. A question like how much carbohydrate is only easy to answer for those with a one-size-fits-all solution, which is no solution at all, because we're all quite different in our needs. At Built for Motion, we firmly believe in tailoring nutrition to people's needs and their goals, and would advise everyone to make strategic changes to their diet. Document what happens, learn from your progress or lack of progress, and use that to inform future changes. Having said that, most people are going to do well by either reducing the amount of carbohydrate in their diet or reducing the amount of fat in their diet. Which option is likely to work best for you is going to depend on how well your body copes with glucose and therefore carbohydrates in general. If you're trying to get leaner and have glucose intolerance, meaning you've been told you're insulin resistant, have impaired glucose tolerance, have impaired fasting glucose, metabolic syndrome, pre-diabetes or type 2 diabetes, or non-alcoholic fatty liver, then start by restricting your carbohydrates. This may run counter to the advice that you've been given, but it makes an awful lot of sense when you think about it. It's fairly intuitive after all, and quite sensible to avoid things we tolerate poorly, especially in food terms. So if you have a condition diagnosed on the basis of your body's inability to deal well with glucose and therefore carbohydrates, it doesn't make much sense to get most of your nutrition from foods that are rich in carbohydrates. We'll look at this a little bit more, but first, a bonus question. What do we need carbohydrates for? We do need glucose specifically, because some of our cells cannot use any other fuel source. But as mentioned earlier, our bodies can make glucose from other nutrients, such as from the amino acids that make up protein. So carbohydrates in the diet are not strictly speaking essential. Realistically though, it's almost impossible not to consume some carbohydrates when eating a diet of real, minimally processed whole foods. It also isn't particularly pleasant or healthy to go extremely low in carbohydrates for the majority of people. But it is a viable option to go low and certainly to reduce the carbohydrates. It can take some getting used to though. As well as certain cells needing glucose, certain activities are also very dependent on glucose. Any high intensity physical activity, for example, sprinting or lifting a heavy object or anything else that you'd only be able to do for a few seconds, is going to tap heavily into your stored glucose. That's just how our bodies work. Also, many of us these days have actually become what's been termed metabolically inflexible. This is a fancy way of saying our bodies become bad at switching between using mostly carbohydrates to fuel what we're doing and using mostly fat. I've seen this time and time again while working in a clinical exercise laboratory, with people basically trapped in carbohydrate burning mode all of the time, even when the conditions were theoretically ideal for their bodies to burn mostly fat, they were still burning mostly carbohydrate. In contrast, a person with good metabolic flexibility will be able to fuel most of their activities throughout the day, except for intense exercise, mostly with fat. Even they will rely on glucose for the higher intensity activities. Lower intensity activities though, such as walking, running, any kind of distance, swims or bike rides, can all be fueled more heavily by fat in a person with good metabolic flexibility. In those who have lost their metabolic flexibility, it will probably take days, more likely weeks, of appropriate exercise and nutrition to gain it back. It's well worth it though, as restoring metabolic flexibility is part of restoring metabolic health, and the health of your metabolism really determines the health of the rest of your body as well. The next question is, what carbohydrates? The concept of complex and simple carbohydrates is outdated. The assumption that so-called complex carbohydrates, such as starches, have a less dramatic effect on the body than simple sugars doesn't always hold true. The idea that has replaced the complex and simple carbohydrate divide is something called glycemic index, usually abbreviated to simply GI. The GI, or glycemic index, is a reflection of how quickly blood glucose rises in response to a carbohydrate-containing food or meal. We can see an example in red for the high GI food. Blood glucose rises rapidly in response to a food like that, does stay quite high for some time, and then comes down. That's in someone with a healthy metabolism. All else being equal, the high GI food will result in this faster and greater rise in blood glucose than would a moderate or a low GI food, as shown in the yellow, which causes a much less dramatic rise and then a slow decline. Lower GI foods are therefore preferable under most circumstances, as they provide our bodies with more time to control the blood glucose range within our blood and keep it within the healthy parameters. Unfortunately, glycemic index is not without its problems, far from it. Studies done to test the GI of various foods and meals are often done in small numbers of relatively healthy young people. There's still a lot of variation from person to person, and even some variation from day to day. These variations are usually small enough for the system to still give broad categories of high, moderate and low, but they do vary a little bit around the details. A more serious issue is that GI tests require a standard amount of carbohydrate to be eaten, usually 50 grams or 100 grams. The reason is simple. Glycemic index is a relative score. It's one food or meal relative to another. And the comparison is almost always a glucose drink. That being considered to be very much the hallmark of high glycemic index. The amount of carbohydrate in the food or meal has to match the amount that will be given in a drink. This doesn't always reflect how we consume food in real life. For example, carrots have a high GI, but to do a GI test with carrots would require eating about half a kilogram or a little over a pound to add up to the required 50 grams of carbohydrate. Something similar would be true for blueberries, where it would take 2¼ cups to add up to 50 grams. Quite an unreasonable amount for most people to have. On the other hand, you would get 50 grams of carbohydrates from about 1 cup of cooked long grain rice or a cup of raw oats, probably something that people might actually eat. Things like cooking and even freezing can change the glycemic index of a food. The biggest effect is what else you have in your meal. We usually don't just have carrots, blueberries, rice or oats on their own. We have them in combination with other foods to make it into a meal or a snack. And the meal will be more than the sum of its parts when it comes to the glycemic index. Finally, although the glycemic index is often considered particularly relevant to people with diabetes as they have a harder time controlling their blood glucose, actual tests are seldom done in these people. If you have one of these conditions or for some other reason have a glucose meter, I would strongly encourage you to actually test how you personally respond to foods and meals that you eat regularly. The goal after all is to keep your blood glucose average within set limits and also minimize the time that you spend with your blood glucose very high or very low. This is always going to be easier to achieve with a lower carbohydrate diet, but whatever dietary choices you make, assuming your aim is to control your blood glucose, try to find out for yourself what effect your dietary staples have on you. Expanding on this example, and to illustrate the point, have a look at these graphs of glucose response to some meals containing rice and chutney as the base, and then changing the type of bean or lentil dish had as an accompaniment. All the meals are also compared to a standard glucose test, which simply involves drinking a glucose drink. On the left is the blood glucose response in people with normal glucose tolerance, so those who cope quite well with carbohydrates. You can see the glucose drink still makes blood glucose shoot up a little, but all the meals, whether they included chickpeas, green, black, red gram or lentils, had a fairly modest effect. The body of these people was quite capable of keeping blood glucose fairly tightly controlled following these meals. And that's consistent with the relatively low glycemic index of these foods. In contrast, in people with type 2 diabetes shown on the right, all the meals caused blood glucose to rise substantially and stay up for a long time. Unsurprisingly, a glucose drink had the biggest effect, as that's the most quickly absorbed. The difference in the effect of these meals between those with normal glucose tolerance on the left and those with impaired glucose tolerance associated with type 2 diabetes shown on the right is even more obvious when we look at the blood insulin response. Insulin is like the traffic control for glucose and less directly for fats and amino acids. It's the hormone that helps decide where in our body glucose goes and what happens to it once it gets there. On the left, in people with normal glucose tolerance, we see a modest rise in insulin for everything except the glucose drink. This makes sense. Insulin being responsible for directing the glucose from the meal around the body, we would expect our body to respond to any amount of glucose with at least some rise of insulin. But on the right, we see a much greater rise in insulin in the people with type 2 diabetes. And that is consistent with the fact that these people are what's known as insulin resistant, or if you prefer, their bodies have become somewhat deaf to the signal that insulin is providing. As a result, more insulin, often much more insulin, is needed to get the job done. If you look carefully, you'll notice that actually, in the normal response people, the glucose drink causes the insulin to rise further than the glucose drink does in those with type 2 diabetes. And that's because in this condition, not only are people's bodies resistant to the effect of insulin, but over time, they've gotten worse at producing the insulin itself. Why these graphs are relevant is that it's often assumed that low glycemic index foods like beans and lentils, as tested in these meals, require less insulin to be properly processed by our bodies. But we can see here that this isn't as clear-cut in people with type 2 diabetes, precisely the people who would be interested in the GI of a food. For example, the blood insulin in response to red gram, the orange line, and black gram, the yellow line, is still going up after 2 hours in people with type 2 diabetes. So even with these lower GI foods, the body of someone with type 2 diabetes, and the conditions listed earlier that can lead up to type 2 diabetes, has to work hard to process the carbohydrate contained. And that's why reducing carbohydrate in meals is probably the first port of call that people with these conditions should be making. The next question is when? When is the best time to have carbohydrates? Our bodies cope best with carbohydrates after physical activity, especially more strenuous exercise. They actually cope best with fat and protein after physical activity as well. After exercise, more of the nutrients we eat are shuttled off to our muscles, specifically the ones we use most during the exercise. So when we eat carbohydrates after exercise, the glucose, rather than going mostly to our livers and fat cells, goes mostly to our working muscles. As a bonus, our bodies will need less insulin to get the job done if we have the carbohydrate shortly following physical activity. Whether your overall diet is high or low in carbohydrates, aim to have your highest carbohydrate meal after exercise, but wait a good half an hour or so, because it's much better to eat in a nice calm state than immediately after you've just worked out. The last question, what are good sources of carbohydrates? So with all that said, where should you be going for your carbohydrates? If you're on a reduced carbohydrate diet, good sources would be things like berries, yams, pumpkins and squashes, beans and lentils, depending of course on your tolerance, as well as kumara, or you might know it as sweet potato. These are also fine on a higher carbohydrate diet, but if you're on a high carbohydrate diet, you might like to add potatoes, rice, and various grains and grain products, again depending on your tolerance of those. As with previous recommendations, go for minimally refined options of all of these foods. That really brings to close this module on carbohydrates. As a reminder, if you are particularly interested in type 2 diabetes and related conditions, we do have other short talks on our website that address those more specifically. To learn more about the importance of keeping yourself well hydrated, the benefits of the right kind of dietary fibre, and how to avoid being taken for a ride by the food industry, please also check out modules 5, 6 and 7.